It was one of the most spectacular losses of the entire Ukraine war. A moment when the mighty Russian bear was revealed to be just a mere flea-bitten koala. On the 13th of April 2022, 2 Ukrainian-made Neptune missiles slammed into the side of the cruiser Moskva. At the time, the vessel was the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, a giant platform bristling with guns and anti-missile defense systems. But not for much longer. Within 24 hours of the attack, the Moskva had sunk beneath the waves, taking maybe hundreds of sailors with it. It was the largest ship lost in battle since the IRA General Belgrano in the 1982 Falklands War, and the first Russian flagship taken out since 1905. In short, its sinking was a humiliation for Vladimir Putin. A humiliation on par with the dictator falling downstairs and soiling himself. Yet, there's more to the Moskva's story than just its watery demise. The first of the Soviet Union's Slava class of cruisers, the Moskva entered service as a cutting-edge platform in the final years of the Cold War. By the time it sank, it would be a badly outdated relic in a world that had left it far behind. A world in which Ukraine was no longer a Russian colony, but a nation ready to fight for its continued independence. On the eve of the war, you'd have been forgiven for thinking that the Russian cruiser Moskva was an indestructible killing machine. In a February 2022 article titled "The Russian Cruiser Moskva Dominates the Black Sea," Forbes contributor David Axe described it as, quote, a 12,500-ton, 612-foot mobile missile battery with nearly 500 people aboard, and enough anti-ship missiles to wipe out the entire Ukrainian navy. Although little known outside of naval circles, it was an assessment other observers shared. After all, this was the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, a vessel that might have been old, but was designed for force projection, a vessel that had already seen action in both the 2008 Russo-Georgian War and Moscow's 2015 intervention in Syria. And make no mistake, on paper at least, the Moskva seemed to live up to the hype. A member of the Slava class, the Moskva was the first of 3 ships designed to do what bigger, more expensive battle cruisers could do for just a fraction of the price. Able to hit a top speed of 32 knots and travel a maximum of 6,500 nautical miles, it was relatively mobile, even as it carried with it a whole load of people. Some 476 crewmen plus 62 officers could be comfortably housed on its 186.4-meter length, although some sources claim that at the time of the sinking it was carrying over 700. It was a fairly powerful beast too. With 4 M8KF gas turbines, it could hit something like 120,000 horsepower. But it wasn't the propulsion system or the crew that once made the Moskva so feared. No, that would be its weapons. Originally intended to battle NATO vessels in open water, the Moskva came equipped with 16 tubes for heavy anti-ship P-1000 missiles, plus additional surface-to-air missiles, mortars, torpedoes, and a whole lot of guns. This included some truly dangerous kit, like the 64 S-300 air defense missiles, which could travel 90 kilometers and offered cover against aircraft to any ship operating in the area. It also included 2 OSA MA point defense systems to defend against incoming attacks. If that wasn't enough, there were also fully automatic 6-barreled 30mm Gatling guns capable of firing 5,000 rounds a minute and striking targets over 24 kilometers away. Not that anything was likely to get within 24 kilometers. With a radar capable of seeing things 320 kilometers away, any threat should have been sighted long beforehand. In other words, the Moskva was a mean mother. One you'd theoretically assume could intercept any incoming ship, plane, drone, or missile. And that is just for starters. On top of this, the Moskva also rocked a 130mm twin-barrel AK-130 gun that could fire 40 rounds a minute, plus 533mm torpedoes that could hit submarines up to 6 kilometers away. Oh, and it also had its own helicopter deck, just in case, one capable of deploying Kamov Ka-27 military choppers. Now, for most people, this laundry list of killing methods was enough to convince them that Russia's flagship was as fearsome as its reputation, an unstoppable machine like the T-100 or ChatGPT. Yet, as we all know, appearances can be deceiving. Just as Doppio might appear a harmless pink-haired teen on the outside but secretly be the vicious gang boss known as Diavolo, so too might a formidable-seeming Russian cruiser really hide an aging rust bucket. Beneath its terrifying exterior, the Moskva was in dire need of a refit and modernization. By NATO standards, the weapons and sensors were ancient. More to the point, the structure had been made using flammable materials. Were a couple of missiles to miraculously get through and strike the vessel, then the crew might really be in quite a bit of trouble. One of the little ironies of the Ukraine war is how many symbols of Russian might were actually built in Moscow's former colony. For instance, Slava-class cruisers started life not in Russia itself, but in the shipyards of Mykolaiv, today a city bearing the brunt of the Kremlin's airstrikes. The year was 1979. The Soviet Union was still standing, Ukraine was firmly under the Russian jackboot, and the idea that Kiev might one day be independent of Moscow was as outlandish as a dog wearing lederhosen. That July, a new class of warship launched from the 61 Komunara shipbuilding plant. Known as Slava, it was intended to be the first of 6 new vessels. 6 vessels that would complement the nuclear-powered Kirov battleship class across the seas. Interestingly, at least 2 of these vessels would wear their Ukrainian origins proudly. The third cruiser, eventually named RFS Varyag, was known as the Chervona Ukraina, or Red Ukraine, while under construction. The fourth was simply to be called the Ukraina. But notice the hypothetical in that sentence. The Ukraina would never quite get to the part where it actually became reality. This was for the simple reason that the USSR collapsed before it could be finished. The complete breakup of the communist superstate left the Ukraina an unfinished hulk lurking in Mykolaiv's docks. Her younger sisters, the Oktyabrska Revolutsiya and Admiral Gorshkov, never even made it off the drawing board. That meant only 3 Slava-class ships ever sailed: the Varyag, the Marshal Ustinov, and, most infamously, the Moskva. Not that it was called the Moskva yet. As the first in its class, the Moskva has spent its first decade sporting the name Slava, a word that means glory, and is probably best known in the West thanks to the pro-Ukraine slogan, Slava Ukraini. Not that the Slava did anything particularly glorious during the Cold War. It tended to fight NATO battlecruisers. The ship instead poodled around the Black Sea, an impressive-looking but ultimately unnecessary platform. It would only be long after it changed its name to Moskva in 1995 that the ship finally did what it was built to do. By then, the USSR was nothing but a fragment of history, a fever dream the world had finally woken up from. Once subjugated nations were now free, able to forge their own destinies. Nations like Ukraine, Estonia, and Kazakhstan. But not every former Soviet republic would be able to escape the Kremlin's orbit, especially as independent Russia began to quickly shift from a wild economic basket case to a vengeful militaristic predator. Sadly, it would be as part of this increasingly fascist Russia that the Moskva finally found its stride. The descent began in 2008. That August, the Kremlin launched the invasion of the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, leading to a short but bloody war. Over 5 days of mayhem, the Moskva led the assault from the Black Sea, using its impressive air defense system to provide cover as the Russian fleet came steaming in to destroy the tiny Georgian navy. While one errant missile would score a hit on the Moskva, it was mere surface damage. Protected by the Moskva, the Kremlin's forces annihilated Georgia's defenses, staged a landing, and took control of the city of Poti. Shortly after, Georgia surrendered. The result would be the effective Russian occupation of 20% of Georgia's territory, with pro-Kremlin puppets installed in the regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Just to make sure the Georgians didn't get any ideas, the Moskva stayed moored off the coast, a menacing shadow lurking just on the horizon. Yet it would be in the waters of an entirely different Black Sea nation that the Moskva would reach new heights of infamy. We're talking, of course, about Ukraine. As recently as 2010, there was still hope that an independent Ukraine and Russia could be, if not friends exactly, then at least neighbors. While the Kremlin was still attempting to push Kiev around, it had also yet to launch any invasions. Publicly, Moscow even agreed to fund the finishing of the Slava-class cruiser Ukraina for use by Ukraine. But then came 2012 and Vladimir Putin's return to power. And, well, that was that for the whole Russia is a good neighbor thing. Within 2 years of Putin's return, Crimea had been illegally annexed, a breach of international law facilitated by the Moskva blockading the Ukrainian navy. Just a year later, in 2015, the vessel would be involved in yet another international adventure of dubious legality. From the waters by the Syrian lake of Latakia, the Moskva provided air cover for Russian fighter jets taking off to bomb civilians, something they did with such gusto that it's estimated 24,743 ordinary Syrians were killed by Moscow's air force. But what was a disaster for ordinary people was a boon for the Moskva. Lauded for their tireless work helping to destroy schools and hospitals, its crew were decorated. By the time the ship went in for repairs and refitting in 2020, it was so celebrated by the Putin regime that Orthodox officials chose to carry a fragment of what they claimed was the true cross. As in, the same cross that Jesus was crucified on. Yet, while everything might have been looking good for the Moskva from the outside, beneath the surface things were far from okay. By now, over 40 years old, the Moskva desperately needed not just repairs, but a complete overhaul and modernization. Unfortunately, the Russian state couldn't provide that. A lot of Soviet maritime industry had been based in Ukraine, and when it strode out the exit, that knowledge went with it. As a result, the Russian Navy relied heavily on Ukraine for critical components like marine engines, critical components that Kiev was absolutely not in the mood to supply to the country that had just annexed their territory. That meant the 2020 repairs did nothing to fix the Moskva's growing list of problems: its antiquity, its unsuitability for contemporary maritime combat. Had the Putin regime been honest with itself, it might have recognized that the Slava class was not fit for modern war, that there was just too great a risk that it could be sunk by determined Ukrainian resistance. Clearly, though, being honest with itself is not something the Putin regime excelled at. When the signal came in the early hours of February the 24th, 2022, the Moskva would be helping lead Russia's full-scale invasion from the Black Sea. Just as in Syria, what happened next would make the vessel and her crew famous. This time, though, it would be for all the wrong reasons. And so we come to one of the most iconic acts of resistance in all of history. On February the 24th, the Moskva approached the small Ukrainian garrison on Snake Island, a strategically important lump of rock in the Black Sea. Bristling with weapons and radiating menace, it beamed a simple message to the 100 or so defenders on the island. I suggest you lay down your weapons and surrender to avoid bloodshed and needless casualties, otherwise you will be bombed. To which 31-year-old Ukrainian border guard Roman Herabov would memorably reply, "A Russian warship, go f*** yourself." It was the birth of a billion memes, an early sign for Putin that Ukraine wouldn't just lie down and surrender before his brutal tactics. But not even the most optimistic observer back then could have predicted the fate that would soon be forced upon the Moskva. By April the 13th, 2022, the Moskva's crew had every reason to feel confident. The opening hours of the invasion had seen Ukraine's navy sunk or scuttled, and while the Russian army might be facing problems on land, Moscow was the undisputed master of the Black Sea. In fact, the Moskva's sailors felt so at ease they were happy to idle a mere 120 kilometers off the Ukrainian shoreline, using their systems to give umbrella cover to the newly captured Snake Island. But for those watching the war closely, there were already signs that maybe, just maybe, the crew shouldn't get too comfortable. Warning signs that spoke to a growing Ukrainian ability to deal death on the high seas. Just weeks earlier, the Russian ship Orsk had been blown up while in port in occupied Ukraine, spewing fire high into the sky. At the time, it had been Russia's biggest naval loss in decades. Although embarrassed, many pro-war commentators had deemed it a fluke hit. So confident were they in Russia's invincibility. It was this confidence that would shortly spell the end for the Moskva. Over those chaotic first weeks of war, Ukrainian forces had been desperately trialing their newest untested weapons to see what worked. Among them was the RK-360MC Neptune anti-ship missile. Put into production following Russia's annexation of Crimea, the missile had been demonstrated in 2018, but only put into mass production in 2021. So new was the Neptune that the first batch had only left the warehouse on February the 20th, 2022, mere days before the full-scale invasion began. Since then, though, it had been successfully fired over Mykolaiv. Now several were deployed to the southern shoreline, ready and waiting in case an opportunity emerged. And on April the 13th, that's exactly what happened. Now, there are a couple of versions of this story. One in which NATO did all the hard work, and one in which Ukraine was the sole author of the Moskva's sinking. In the NATO version, European Command helped Kiev find the coordinates for the vessel. In the Ukrainian version, though, that the ship was ever detected was down to sheer fluke. That day, heavy clouds hung low over the Black Sea, so low that radar pinged out by a spotter on the shore was able to bounce between cloud and sea, increasing its detection range by dozens of kilometers. Whether you buy this or not, the result was essentially the same. Around 1600 local time, a Ukrainian unit with Neptune missiles to hand became aware that the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet was idling well within range. It said that the decision to fire took no time at all. Shortly after 4 p.m, 2 Neptune missiles streaked into the sky, veering out over the ocean where they would hug the choppy water surface on their deadly voyage, flying low to avoid detection. The travel time between launch site and the Moskva was 6 minutes. 6 agonizing minutes in which no one knew if the missiles would reach their target or be taken out by the ship's defenses. With cloud cover so thick it was impossible to fly drones to find out. But the Neptune's operators needn't have worried. Both missiles were destined to score direct hits. What came next played out on radar screens for Ukraine's defenders to see. The way the Moskva suddenly accelerated to full speed as if trying to flee the area. The way 4 other ships began to scurry towards it from Crimea on a rescue mission. Yet the rescue ships wouldn't make it in time. That afternoon, a sudden storm blew up, making it impossible to tow the Moskva to safety. In the tempest, precious hours were lost, hours in which the Moskva sank lower and lower and took on more water until salvaging it became impossible. The next day, April the 14th, the Moskva finally sank below the waves, taking with it anywhere from a few dozen to hundreds of sailors. Although Russian propaganda would try to claim that it sank as the result of an accidental fire, everybody knows the truth. Against all the odds, the Ukrainians had done it. With just 2 missiles, they'd taken down the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet. A symbol of Russia's invulnerability had just been reduced to a sunken wreck. Today, over a year later, the Moskva remains the largest ship sunk in warfare since the ARA General Belgrano in 1982, and the first Russian flagship lost to enemy fire since the Knyaz Suvorov in 1905. In any form of conflict, it would have been a jaw-dropping loss. But up against an opponent with no navy to speak of, well, it was nothing short of humiliating. A blazing symbol of Putin's impotence broadcast for all the world to see. A symbol the Ukrainians are determined to ensure the world never forgets. Days after the Moskva's sinking, the government in Kiev listed it as an underwater heritage site to be preserved for future generations. A reminder for decades to come of just how badly Russia failed in its war. It's a richly deserved end for a vessel that took part in its fair share of invasions and human rights abuses. But it's also something more. As a ship of the Soviet Union, the Moskva was built in Ukraine at a time when communist higher-ups tried to convince their citizens that the 2 nations were friends, equals, bonded together in a mutually beneficial partnership. While the use of the Moskva to terrorize and attack Ukraine has shown that image up for what it always was, a lie. A lie told by the Kremlin to justify its colonial empire, an empire the wannabe Tsar Putin dreams so desperately of rebuilding. We can only hope that in the coming months his dream goes the same way as the Moskva, reduced to nothing more than a pitiful, broken wreck by Ukraine bravely standing up to its old overlord.